It's particularly interesting, but that's a euphemism really for worrying time in the Middle East with the elections in Egypt and the lack of power and authority in Syria right now, the place of Israel. A great guest to have on this is Jonathan Davis, who's head of a highly prestigious school institute, Raphael Recanati International School. He was a spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces and a fascinating past as well. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I didn't know much about the school itself, but I kept meeting people, very bright young people, who are going off there to study anti-terrorism and diplomacy and so on. So what actually does it do? It's a university.
We're Israel's first private university.
I see.
We believe in free enterprise, and we're Zionistic in our philosophy. We believe that we should be training the future cadre of leadership for the State of Israel.
Well, I'm impressed. The future of Israel, I hate to sound in any way pessimistic, but my goodness, there was a time when Iran was a friend, Turkey was a friend, the peace treaty with Egypt was solid. Now you have the Brotherhood to rule in Egypt. Iran hates you, Turkey's ambivalent at best. Syria could fall to the Brotherhood. How are you feeling about things?
Well, it's an interesting neighborhood to live in, actually. It's a rough neighborhood to live in.
Yeah.
And at all times, we just have to be vigilant about what's happening. We have to act with moderation, but at the same time be firm in securing the future of the State of Israel and the welfare of its citizens.
Friendships have changed. I find this quite fascinating. I was watching coverage of Putin in Israel, and I think Putin probably at gut level is fairly supportive, actually. I think he's relatively philo-Semitic. I don't think he has an agenda against Israel, but he'll do what Russia needs to do. But he was there visiting. We have people in the past in Eastern Europe who traditionally were not great friends of the Jews supporting Israel. But some of those who were traditional friends in Western Europe now are beginning to change.
Well, actually, I'm pleasantly surprised by some of the countries in Western Europe who, over the last few years, have changed some of their policies towards Israel.
Oh, really?
When you take a look at countries like Greece, and you take a look at countries like Italy, and you take a look at Spain and France and the United Kingdom, they appear to understand what some of the realities are, much more than they did, let's say, 10 years ago.
Spain, really?
Spain, there's also been a change.
Because Spain could be, you'd read the Spanish press sometimes, and I don't say this about most countries, it bordered on the anti-Semitic.
Well, there are pockets of anti-Semitism throughout Europe, and some of the groups who try to demonize Israel in parts of Europe are actually using anti-Zionism as an excuse for anti-Semitism. Now,
militarily, and here one of the ironies, well, the paradoxes, I suppose, militarily the country's never been stronger. Economically, you've never been stronger. If we just look at the Israeli economy alone, it's a miracle within an area where, apart from oil, there'd be universal bankruptcy. So these things are very good. But what about the morale of the people? There was a time, when I first went to Israel back in, when was it, 79, that this idea that everyone was a pioneer, it still held on. That's changed, though. A lot of Israelis are looking at the good and easy life abroad.
Israel's a global kind of country, and Israel is amongst the top 3 countries on NASDAQ. We're global, we're a startup nation, economy, very high-tech oriented, and it's natural for many Israelis to travel the world in their businesses. What I try to do sometimes is tell our students, we should be like England in the 19th century. Ultimately, all the ships come back to port to England.
You want an empire, do you?
Not an empire, but I want our folks to be global, but to remember their home port and to come back to Israel. And I think that Israel, not having massive amounts of natural resources, can be a very good port for global aspects of high tech and so on and so forth. And I think we're doing that pretty successfully right now.
But the elephant in the room has to be the Palestinian issue. And frankly, I don't see it as being any closer to solution now than it was 10 years ago.
No, I don't see it any closer to solution either, and I would welcome the leadership of the Palestinians to sit down with us and talk. You know, we left Gaza completely, every square inch of it, and instead of people from Hamastan talking to us in Gaza, they fire rockets at us. We froze settlements in Judea and Samaria for at least 10 months, and nobody spoke to us. There was no partner to speak to us. So I think ultimately the Palestinian side has to recognize the fact that just as the Jewish people have been around for more than 3,000 years, and our connection to the land of Israel is more than 3,000 years old, this is a Jewish state. and they need to contend with that. And I think they need to come to reality also that there isn't going to be some sort of law of return for millions of Palestinians to move back to Israel. And I think once they understand that, we can negotiate in good faith.
I have to say, I won't win too many friends by saying this, that as much as I do want a just solution to this issue, it is amazing that with a fairly small number of refugees in 1948, there are now millions of Palestinian refugees. The birth rate must be beyond human comprehension. I mean, let's be honest there. A lot of these figures are made up. There aren't that many Palestinians.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's really interesting because in the late 1940s and early 50s, Israel absorbed 800,000 Jews from Middle Eastern lands who were refugees, for all intents and purposes refugees. Refugees sometimes with backgrounds of having been accountants or lawyers or sometimes blue-collar workers. Refugees from countries such as Iraq and countries such as Syria and Egypt and Libya and other parts of North Africa, Morocco. 800,000 of them. Most of them were actually living in tents for a number of years in the 1950s in what really looks like refugee camps. In fact, tents whose conditions are far, far worse than what you would find in Gaza or anything in Judea and Samaria. And yet, the State of Israel decided that those 800,000 refugees who came to Israel, who lost their homes, lost their properties, lost their jobs, they were retrained in Israel and they joined the Israeli economy. And thank goodness the Israeli economy today is growing at a pace of 3.1% per annum, and those refugees were incorporated. It's a shame that the Palestinian refugees who moved to Lebanon or to Syria or to Jordan or even to the West Bank. For 20 years, Jordan was responsible for the West Bank. And why didn't those Palestinian refugees in those parts, why weren't they trained? Why didn't they become productive citizens?
Well, you know the answer to that.
It's a rhetorical question.
And both sides are to blame. In Lebanon, Palestinians are denied all sorts of jobs, but Lebanon is never the victim of a boycott or censor. In Jordan, which is what, majority Palestinian now, Jordan, I've never met a Palestinian in Jordan who has a senior military position. They're all Bedouin, they're all loyal to the monarchy. And just very briefly before we go, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but it's still the army effectively in power. Does it change very much?
It could change. We have to remember, in my opinion, what happened in Iran after the revolution. At first it was moderate. Let's see what happened in Turkey. The military used to be responsible in Turkey. The military weakened in Turkey. You've got generals sometimes in jail in Turkey, and so on and so forth. That could happen in Egypt. And when I see the Hamas rejoicing at the results of the elections in Egypt, it makes me think a little bit.
I bet it does. A pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Michael, thank you very much.